Good afternoon and welcome to Let's Start Justice. It's Tuesday, February 14th. I'm Michael Jackson, Executive Director for JFJ.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist.
Now, we continue our conversation, Jade and listeners, because we do celebrate Black History Month. We celebrate Black History every day of the year.
Yes.
But certainly we're leveraging the fact that
Black History Month.
We commemorate, yes. Difference in languages.
Yes.
All right, so we continue the conversation, and today we're going to be focusing on one of my personal favorite national heroes.
Yes.
That has contributed tremendously to Jamaica's development, and what I would say is a far-reaching thinker that also influenced Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. So yes. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and by the way, just a little bit of trivia. Marcus's house, Mr. Garvey's house, is just up the road from where I grew up, Gully Road in St. Anne's Bay.
Okay.
So my bond very, very good.
Okay, I see you like to bring proximity to greatness here.
Absolutely. The family said that we're related somehow. I don't believe that part of the history, but that's what they say. But again, welcome so much. Just to say to the listeners, we're going to be sharing our human rights recap in the second half of the program. And following Jade's introduction to the human rights of the week and so on, we're going to go straight to the conversation for today. So Jade, over to you.
Yes, so this week our human right of the day is based in the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and that is an international instrument that Jamaica is a signatory to and has been a signatory to for quite some time. I can't tell you when that is. Mikhail, don't say. So we are looking at Article 2 today, and it states that state parties, as a signatory to this instrument, have a responsibility to condemn racial discrimination, and as a part of that condemnation, to ensure that it is promoting understanding amongst all races and take effective measures to review governmental, national, and local policies and amend, rescind, and nullify any laws that have the effect of creating or perpetuating racial discrimination wherever it exists. So this is here to ensure that we are able to live equally regardless of race and color in this country.
Yes.
All right. So our trivia question for today, which is why I didn't want Brightness Mikkel to give you guys the answer, is when did Jamaica ratify that convention? So when did Jamaica ratify the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination? And the winner of that will get a free phone card. You can let us know what your response is via Instagram on our Instagram page, or you can WhatsApp us. Mikhail, do you remember the WhatsApp number?
It's 239-7583.
Thank you very much. So go ahead and engage.
All right, so we said we're continuing the conversation around Black History Month, and we're focusing on Marcus Mosiah Garvey and really getting an understanding of the influence of Garveyism, cultural renewal, and its connection to human rights. Mm-hmm. And we just want to point out that Marcus Garvey is Jamaica's first national hero. He formed the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which was the largest mass movement in African American history, proclaiming a Back to Africa message and provoking consciousness through questioning, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? These questions, messages, and ideologies of Garvey saw the UNIA establish some 700 branches in 38 states by the early 1920s in the United States of America. And central to Garvey's messages were themes of unity, pride in the African cultural heritage, and complete autonomy, self-reliance, and self-governance as a race. Before I switch to you, Jade, I just want to point out that in 1929, Marcus Garvey established one of the first organized political parties in Jamaica's history, the People's Progressive Party. And that party, some things that we still continue to fight for today, Marcus Garvey placed in his manifesto then things such as minimum wage. As you know, in the 1920s, we had not yet achieved universal adult suffrage. And Marcus Garvey was saying we need more representation at local government. So some of the things that we still continue to have dialogue around, you recognize, for example, local government elections have not yet been called.
Yes.
So it's an interesting conversation that we're having today. Just a little tidbit of history. Marcus Garvey, again, supported by Amy Garvey. I have to plug that part as a woman, and the support system that we provide, that he formed the first organized political party in Jamaica's history.
Yes, so 83 years after his death, Marcus Garvey's message of racial pride continues to impact persons of African descent, including our local Rastafarian community, which still embraces the philosophy of Garveyism, and in particular, avoiding any alteration of natural features such as hair straightening and skin lightening, which we can see continues to be conversations not only in our social context but also in our institutional context in terms of the rules that are encouraged by our schools. In 2012, the Ministry of Education made the teachings of Garveyism a mandatory part of the new civics program to be taught in schools to encourage students' self-pride as well as awareness of their worth and right to dignity.
Now, despite the ideologies of Garveyism, we continue to see the erosion of cultural identity of people of color across the English-speaking Caribbean islands, arguably so, particularly as a result of classism, colorism, racism and sexism, and other discriminatory practices in the country. And people for the introduction, and we have been calling for the introduction of the teachings and principles of our first national hero. And we have on the call here with us three very learned guests, if you will. Barbara Blake Hanna, cultural liaison and founder of the Jamaican Reparation Movement. Stephen Golding, president of the UNIAACL Jamaica, as well as Sydney Bartley, culture expert and consultant. Welcome, gentlemen and lady.
Thank you.
All right, we have all three guests on the call.
I don't think Barbara is with us yet, but good afternoon to you all. Good afternoon, Sydney.
Hi, Stephen.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. So let me start with you, Mr. Golding. From where you sit, what is the importance of Garveyism being the first national hero, as well as his ideologies continue to be taught in the Jamaican society? What is the significance of Garveyism in that regard?
Let's make sure that people understand what you mean when you say Garveyism. Garveyism is just another term for Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism, as it is defined, is understanding that or accepting the philosophy that the past, present, and future of all Africans and African descendants around the world are linked together. And so in order for us to achieve and to progress in the way that we need to overcome the obstacles of our past, we need to do so together and in a spirit of unity. Yes. Marcus Garvey expressed that. He was not the first to express that, but he certainly was one of the best to express it, which was reflected in the fact that the UNIA to date is still the largest mass movement of people ever put together. Garvey coined his mission as African redemption, to restore value not only to African people but to the African continent, and as he put it, to create an African empire strong enough to protect its people all over the world. So if you're asking me what the significance of that is, apart from the fact that we have not fully achieved that, and part of the reason we have not achieved that is because for a long time after Garvey's death, there was a big smear campaign against him, even while he was living. Even many Jamaicans in the past used to wrongly accuse him, as the Federal Bureau of Investigation did in the United States, of being a con man or of being a hustler or being a thief, when in fact he rightfully was our first national hero. And before he was our first national hero, is one of the first black icons of the 20th century, whose name was known on all continents, and whose movement, I heard you mention the 700 plus chapters of the UNIA in the United States alone, but the country with the most UNIA chapters was Cuba. Mm-hmm. And overall there were over 1,000 divisions reaching as far as to the Australian continent. Garvey's organizations on the continent too also went a long way in achieving African independence. The African National Congress itself is a descendant of the UNIA and the work of Garveyites in Azania or in South Africa at the time. So rightfully so, he is our first national hero, but he belongs to the world, and his philosophy has inspired African people for multiple generations. Even in the recent Black Lives Matter, we saw the flag that Garvey gave to the race, the red, black, and green, flying high, not only in the cities of the United States, but in Europe and in London when they were toppling the statues of slave masters.
Yes.
And I don't know how many Jamaican students know that that flag was created by Marcus Garvey, given to the race at the first International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World in 1920, as one of the declarations that the colors red, black, and green shall be the colors of our race. One of those declarations also was to declare August 31st an international holiday for the Negro race, and that came to fruition in 2021 when the United Nations itself declared it the International Day for People of African Descent. So Garvey's teachings and his works continue to reverberate even now into the 21st century, despite the efforts of some to downplay, to criticize, to ridicule, to smear, to tear down his legacy.
Before we take the break, thank you so much for that. Our listeners have been sending us WhatsApp message because, as you know, we're a human rights organization, and some of them couldn't readily appreciate why we're focusing on celebrating the contribution of Marcus Garvey and its connection to human rights and how Garvey himself would have,
Shame on them.
Sorry?
Garvey was one. Shame on them.
Yes.
For saying that. It reveals their own ignorance.
Absolutely.
Garvey was one of the first champions of human rights. In fact, through the UNIA, Garvey lifted the issue of the rights of black people in the world from the level of a civil rights issue that is contained within any particular nationality. For example, the United States of America, where he lived for some time.
Yes, pause that thought for me, though, Mr. Golding. Let us take the break and then you finish it for me, because I really want you to drive home that connection for our listeners, please. We take the break.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. Today we are following our Black History Month theme and talking about Garveyism, cultural renewal, and human rights. We are joined by Stephen Golding, Sydney Bartlett, and recently joined by Barbara Blake Hanna in the break.
Sydney Bartley.
Yes, sorry. My apologies. Yeah, so when we left for the break, Mr. Golding, you were giving us a very poignant history lesson on Garvey, and you were mentioning now the connection between human rights and Garveyism. So if you could just continue on that train of thought for us.
Yeah, I was simply saying that Garvey was one of the first to elevate the issue of the rights of black people from a civil rights issue in a particular country to a human rights issue on a global level. And, Garvey himself convened an international convention of black people from around the world in 1920 and issued a declaration of the rights of the Negro people of the world.
Yes.
And this preceded the UN Declaration of Human Rights by over 2 decades. In fact, a number of the declarations in the Human Rights Declaration of 48 contained things that Garvey had put in his own Declaration of Rights of the people of the Negro people of the world in 1920. So for people to say, why are you focusing on Garvey in terms of human rights? They need to know he was one of the earliest champions of human rights.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Mr. Bartley, if you will, you're a culture expert. And when you talk about our cultural norms in Jamaica, what more can be done so that we understand the ideology of Marcus Garvey in terms of our way of life, our thought process, how we celebrate our national heroes and their contribution? What more can be done from your estimation?
Well, a lot more can be done, and if I want to endorse what Stephen said all before, and the concept of Garvey human rights, I think some of us need to remember that there was a time when, by white people's standards, black people were not human. And so when we get to the stage where we think that our right to the humanity is an assured right, we need to realize that this was not always so. And history can repeat itself. And so the concept of who we are as a people becomes foundational to any policy or any practice that we do in a country like Jamaica. I've always said in any country that is a post-slavery country, post-slavery, post-slave trade, that country situates itself, locates itself on a platform in which the people who are black were devalued, were dysfunctionalized, were disenfranchised throughout the history of this country. And so the concept of re-enfranchisement of our people is foundational to the sense of who we are as a people. And let us understand that the 2011 census in Jamaica identified that people of African descent are over 92% of the out of many one people that we are. And so the concept of where you are from is an important element of who we are. Where were we from? The African element of our identity has been dysfunctionalized, has been devalued a lot of times, thanks to Garvey, thanks to Rastafari. It has been positioned at the centrality of Jamaican culture. And we noted that in the 2003 National Cultural Policy. So for me, all element of Jamaica's political development and political policy has to be grounded in the philosophy of Marcus Garvey, who was the person who has been most forthright in bringing the state of affairs of our people to prominence and to promote the rights, responsibilities, and integrity of our people. That is fundamental to anything that we are doing. So we need to remember that Garvey said, if a people, there is nothing more dangerous than to build a society if a large segment of that society is not feel that they have no stake in it. And you feel you have no stake in a society if you don't see yourselves in the programs and the policies. We've come a long way. We are a post-slavery society. We've come a long way, but remember, the shackles of mental enslavement still reside among us. And that can be dealt with if we only understood and promoted more of the philosophies of Marcus Garvey. I think that is very, very important and very, very significant.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bartley. And when you talk about the shackles of mental enslavement, for our viewers, could you just illustrate what you mean by shackles of mental enslavement? What are the vestiges that we continue to?
The one thing I always use for people is this. I say to people sometimes, and anybody, I say, I'm going to give you a message to go up into one of those places in Kingston where we consider to be the home of the affluent in Jamaica, where the Cherry Gardens, Jacks Hill, whatever. And I'm going to say to you, give this message only to the owner of the house. And I'm going to position two houses right beside each other. They look the same, manicured lawns, and on one house, there's a white man seated on the grass, on the lawn. And in the second house, there's a black man seated on the grass, on the lawn. And I challenge many of us that we go to the house where the white man is seated and say, I have a message for you, sir. And we are likely to go to the house where the black man is seated and say, is the owner in? Because we think he's a gardener. That's the kind of thing I use to indicate when we think about certain elements of the status quo, when we think about certain concepts of growth and of individual growth and development, especially in economic terms, we hardly link it to the black people within our community. And that is something we don't feel we have access. We can access certain things by virtue of who we are. And that is a thing that we need to get rid of, because Jamaicans have shown at any rate that we are able, through God, with Garvey leading the way, we are able to achieve a lot more than people thought we could. We have built a diaspora all over the world that is looked upon by the world. And I am one of those who says that Martin Luther King could dream. Rosa Parks could sit on a bus. Barack Obama could say, yes, we can, because they stood on the shoulders of Marcus Garvey. That's where the first dream was solidified.
Barbara Blake Hannah, thank you so much for joining us, cultural liaison and founder of the Jamaican Reparation Movement. One of the central messages to Marcus Garvey is around the concept of reparation. So we're happy that you're here. And if you could just explain that to our listeners so they understand the sentiment and elements and ideology of Garvey within that particular context of reparation for us, please.
Well, first I have to apologize for being late, and also for the fact that I have a bad cold, which you'll hear as I speak. But at this age, no, with Rastafari having begun in the 1930s, a century ago, I'm amazed that there's any Jamaican that doesn't know what reparations is, or that Garvey was one of the ones who articulated that there should be some compensation for the descendants of those who suffered from slavery. In 2001, the United Nations held a very important conference in Durban against racism, at which the issues of reparations were discussed by countries all over the world. And a 19-point final paper was presented, 19 points of forms of reparations. That was 2001, so that was 20 years ago. And it shouldn't be difficult for anyone in the world today to not have heard of what reparations is, which literally is a repair of the lives of those who have suffered from racism, just as the owners of slaves were compensated for the loss of their labor, their income-producing labor. So too the enslaved should have been compensated, and they weren't. And this is the reason why we all live in such beaten down situations in this world, we the descendants of the enslaved. So it's not difficult for me to explain that to anyone who's got half an ounce of sense, to see the validity in that call. What Garvey did was he made us proud of being Black. Until Garvey came along, we were really ashamed. We only knew of ourselves as slaves, descendants of slaves. And Garvey was the one who articulated, no, we have a higher history. We are kings and princes, and we have a marvelous culture in Africa from which we descended. Be proud of it. Be proud of yourselves. And that's really been Garvey's message, why it has resonated, why Jamaica made him a national hero in the 1960s. So that was at least one generation ago, if not two. We certainly should have heard it by now.
Yes.
Programs like this, work that you all do, work that people like Stephen Golding has been doing, and many others, the Garveyites, has certainly brought the message home. And we are just reminding them right now in this program. We're only reminding them. We're not saying anything new. It can't be new to anyone except a newborn child. And it's a good lesson for them to learn right at the beginning. So I said my bit.
Thank you. We're going to take the break. But on the other side of the break, Mr. Golding, you said something earlier, and I think it's important that we debunk some of those unfortunate aspects that have been tied to Garvey's name around mail fraud. I think we have to speak about that and just get it out of the minds of the listeners. And then I want us to close out on the other side, in terms of the impact of Garvey and what is it that we're calling for from our respective places of influence. On the other side of the break, we pick up debunking those myths as well as assessing the impact of Garveyism, in terms of nationalism and so on. Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We're talking about the important legacy of Marcus Garvey and its connection to human rights in Jamaica and across the world, if you will. Such an important contributor to Jamaica's civil and political rights, if you will. Stephen Golding, I want to pick up with you. When you were speaking earlier, you mentioned that there have been attempts in the past to smear the name of Marcus Garvey, and certainly growing up, unfortunately, I was subjected to hearing some of those. But we just want to give you the opportunity to dispel some of those myths that our youngsters may have heard, while we perhaps have not have that concerted effort in celebrating Marcus Garvey to the extent and level that he certainly deserves.
I don't think any Jamaican should grow up suffering from that, because he's been our first national hero since 1964.
Yes.
So we cannot in one hand recognize him as our national hero, see him on our money, and be accepting the fact that he was anything close to how the United States government tried to paint him. It's an easy myth to debunk. Garvey was imprisoned for using the mail to defraud people. What was he defrauding them of, right? He launched a company known as the African Communities League, or ACL, which launched several businesses that did what we would call crowdfunding today, because it wasn't registered on the stock market, but you could only buy stocks of it if you were a member of the UNIA. Now, in 1919, one of those companies that was launched was the Black Star Line. And that very year that that company was launched, even before the idea of mail fraud occurred to the Bureau of Investigations, there is documented a letter from the head of the Bureau of Investigations, a man by the name of J. Edgar Hoover, who, in speaking to the state, at that time, the great fear amongst the United States national security advisors was the Red Terror, communism, following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Hoover wrote a letter saying that, he was concerned about these Negro agitators. Chief among them was Marcus Garvey, and that they had not yet found a reason to arrest or deport him as an unwanted alien, but they would continue to monitor him. So it shows that even before they brought charges against Garvey, they were looking for a reason to hem him up and to get him out of the country. And if you study the case of mail fraud, Garvey was put on trial with 4 other people. He was the only one convicted, and he received the maximum sentence of 5 years. But yet within 2 3/4 years, he was pardoned by the US President Calvin Coolidge. So it really was just a ploy to get Marcus Garvey out of the United States because of the success he was having in arousing the consciousness of Black people, and secondly, in building wealth within the Black community. So for any Jamaican to take up that fabricated story that was fabricated by the Bureau of Investigation, they're not doing themselves justice or any service as a Jamaican, because he is still our first national hero. And he to get that title, you would have had to have demonstrated great apathy for the Jamaican people, and had to have struggled and sacrificed within your own life, right? And that is demonstrated in the fact that you could only buy stocks in the Black Star Line if you were a UNIA member. And Marcus Garvey was one of the largest stockholders in the Black Star Line. Yes. So if he was defrauding anybody, as they claimed he was, he would have been mostly defrauding himself, right?
Very well said. And you made a statement about arousing social consciousness. Yes. I remember my own son, he said it was a Garvey alphabet song, I think, done by Heidel.
Done by me when I
know, I was going there. I was going there. So I'm not sure if you can just quickly.
Your son went to Heidel?
Yes, for 2 years. And he had that song singing to me every night.
You need to give a testimony of what the teaching of Garveyism can do for young Jamaican students. I hope you saw a difference at home.
Yes, and I'm one of those parents. My son is very well versed on our history and appreciate it. So I don't know if you can sing a few lines from the song for us.
Well, I think what he might have been telling you about was some of our Garvey nursery rhymes. We had a project with Heidel where we dissected some of the nursery rhymes that we have been passing on from generation to generation. looking at their origins and what was embedded in the lyrics. And a lot of them reflected European history, much of which came at a time when Europeans weren't being very nice to our ancestors and people of African descent. So we took some of those and remixed it. So things like Jack Be Nimble, Jack Be Quick, which was about a notorious pirate who kept escaping from the London Tower. We changed that into, Kojo was nimble, Kwao was quick, but Nanny bent over the old fire stick, which was a story of how Nanny caught bullets with her, and there were a couple of others, Mary Quite Contrary, which is the story of Mary, the Queen of Scots, and her affinity for the French guillotine, which she used to lop off the head of her political opponents in England. We changed that one to Nanny Quite Uncanny. Where do the red coats go? On bended knees as if to ease, she popped them straight in a row. Which was the one actually about her obia. Magic and catching bullets, right? Somebody broke down that story to me and simply said Nanny had a pistol in between her legs, and she fired on these red coats without revealing the pistol, and that's how the story about bullets and her rear came to be. So we find there's real history in these stories. But if we keep passing on these nursery rhymes, London Bridge is falling down, there's nothing uplifting and inspiring in that to teach young Jamaicans. It's better we make a nursery rhyme about Flatbridge, right? So that they can relate to their own culture. And this, in essence, is Garveyism. You see? So we can teach Garveyism without even talking about Marcus Garvey or his biography or his history. Garveyism is infusing our African culture, our real story, into our educational curriculum. So in Garveyism, we don't teach about Pythagoras, we teach about Imhotep. In Garveyism, we don't teach that Columbus discovered America. We teach about Mansa Abu Bakr II from Mali crossing the Atlantic 200 years before Christopher Columbus had a Moorish navigator show him the way, right? We teach about the Olmecs and their contribution. We teach about the fact that Africans built the pyramids and built the Sphinx and built the universities in Timbuktu. We change the narrative so that we're no longer teaching our children that they are the descendants of slaves. We are the only culture who chooses to do that. After all, the British were enslaved by the Romans, but in their schools, they don't teach that our ancestors were slaves. They don't refer to their ancestors as slaves.
United States doesn't either.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Mr. Golding.
These things are important.
Absolutely.
Yes, that was a very inspiring and informative discussion that we just had. So we are almost at the end of our time. So I'm just going to ask Mr. Bartley and Miss Blake Hannah to give us your final words, starting with Mr. Bartley.
Stephen said it all. I want us to understand when Stephen goes to the point of the nursery rhymes. The Cuban education system after the revolution put culture as the foundation for development. And one of the things they did was to teach Cuban children from they were 3 years old. The first thing a Cuban child at 3 years old in those days learned to read or write was, my name is Jorge, I'm Cuban and I'm proud. And then they would learn statements made by Jose Marti and others. And so because students so when they were writing, they would write things like, a man who does not work is a thief. We cannot continue with a generation of people who only know Marcus Garvey through his biography or his history. Marcus Garvey had a lot to say, and some of these can be put into simple statements that when early childhood education, children in early childhood are learning to read or learning to write, they could have it. Garvey, and I just quote a few, if we as a people realize the greatness from which we came, we would be less likely to disrespect ourselves. If we must give up the silly idea of folding our hands and waiting on God to do everything for us. If God had intended for that, then he would not have given us a mind. Whatever you want in life, you must make up your mind to do it for yourself. These are some simple things that Garvey taught. that Garvey stated, which Stephen as Garveyism. And so we need to understand that the basis of what you're calling cultural renewal, the basis by which a people like Jamaicans who have made such a great impact on the world, that society can rise to a sense of who we are. That comes through Garvey's platform that pronounces our history and our reality as children of kings and queens, of an African civilization that from which everything that we are has emanated and on which everything is rooted and grounded. So I really believe it's not just a cultural policy. It must be an education policy. It's a tourism policy. It's an economic policy. It's a policy that deals with trying to get rid of chronic, persistent poverty. It is all founded in a people who would have a certain kind of image of ourselves. And that's what Garvey meant when he said, if a people does not have confidence in self, they are twice or three times, or nowadays 100 times defeated. And many of us in Jamaica, we don't understand how Usain Bolt, for example, could from a little place in Trelawney, could go to the athletics in Cuba and take on the world and became the legend that he is. That
with a curved spine.
That is and Veronica Campbell-Brown, Shelley, and everybody. We look at it as athletics, but it is also a mindset.
Yes,
that we would have created, that we would have cultivated, that makes Jamaica, in spite of its small size, one of the most expansive global brands in the world. Yes. And the only time that Jamaica and Jamaicans will have that pride in self is when Garvey's philosophies and teaching are taught.
Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Promoted. And let me just close by saying, I just have to congratulate Mr. Grange, because every time she speaks, almost every time, she tries to use something from Marcus Garvey. Sometimes our people, when we are quoting things, we quote Americans, we quote as if Jamaicans have not said anything. We need to revisit and reset our minds to look at what we as a people have developed. We as a people have developed.
Thank you so much. Very educational. We really appreciate it. Stephen Golden, President of UNIA ACL Jamaica, and Sydney Barty.
Mikel?
Yes?
If I could just make a point before you cut us off, in response to two things you said earlier. When you asked Sid to demonstrate mental slavery, there was decades ago at the black doll test, where they would take a black doll and a white doll, put before a black child and ask them, which is the pretty one, which is the good one, right? You ask yourself, if that test was done today, how different the responses would be, and you may be afraid to answer. As it regards Garvey as a forerunner in the reparation movement, I would tell people to look up the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. If you have his book, The Philosophy and Opinions of Garvey, it is on page 136. Or if you're online, just Google the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, 1920, to see Garvey in the light of a human rights champion.
At Madison Square Garden in US.
Yes,
the producers are going to send me something. But thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
The wrong thing you can do with Garvey in half an hour.
Very educational and entertaining at the same time.
Yes.
Again, Stephen Golden and Sydney Bartley. Thank you so much. We take the break.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. Today we would have had a discussion about Garveyism. We switched up the show format a little bit, and we would have moved our Human Rights of the Week discussion to the end of the show, so to this portion. But we are still taking calls if you are interested in participating at 676-4996. So, Mikel?
So I want to start out by mentioning two things as we talk about recap, and I think we can merge them. So we are aware that Parliament it's having its reopening today, if you will, Tuesday, February 14th. So we saw the full scale of the march happening for those who were paying attention earlier, with the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness, marching to Parliament. And the throne speech was delivered,
yes,
if you will, by the Governor General. And you know, we have opinions on that as we move towards a republic. We hope to have, I wouldn't want a ceremonial president, but a functional president, if you will, next time around, delivering our throne speech. But we just want to point out that the throne speech was delivered today, and there were certain policy and legislative agenda that was articulated by the Governor General that outlined what Parliament will be focusing on for the year. And I think Minister of Finance, Dr. Nigel Clark, will be tabling the budget, right? Yes. For 2023-24.
Yes.
So you watched, I missed it.
Well, before you even said that, what is a throne speech for the younger of us?
Well, the legislative agenda,
okay,
of what the government through Parliament intends to achieve for the year. So it may focus on things such as your anti-crime bills that you're planning on tabling, some of which will go before a joint select committee. It may focus on things like how you want to deal with domestic violence in the country. You know, the different pieces of legislation, and there are several that you would have heard.
Yes. So I would have been able to take
so just to say, in simple things, it's a work plan for the Parliament.
Yes.
in simple language, what you are going to do for the year, what you're telling the Jamaican people that you're going to be achieving, and then how much money you're going to spend to achieve all of those activities. Right? Simple enough?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think so. So we would have heard some key points. Couple of them I will highlight. Firstly, welcoming the long-promised amendment of the domestic violence legislation. The intention, based on what the Governor General's comments were today, is to have consultation with the Ministry of National Security, which we also welcome, as we would have said in our submission regarding the Firearms Act, the new Firearms Act. That we would have we saw that there was additional consideration for persons implicated in domestic violence related offenses prior.
So for example, if you have been charged or convicted with a firearm offense, then with a domestic violence offense rather, then you stand the chance of not receiving a firearm by the firearm licensing authority, or you may very well have your firearm rescinded, your permit rescinded.
Absolutely.
And I think that will be integrated into the proposed revised Domestic Violence Act.
Yes.
And there are other things that I think they may be considering why that connection with Ministry of National Security in terms of the police response to domestic violence.
Yes,
absolutely.
And so we are encouraged by this, and we look forward to hearing further developments about what actually comes out of that.
So aside of domestic violence, anything else when you talk about rape-related laws in the country? Anything around Sexual Offences Act?
So I didn't, the Governor General did not mention any of the related legislation. So he didn't mention the Sexual Offences Act or the Offences Against the Person Act. I think we would have heard some disjointed statements from other parliamentarians in other forums indicating their intention and looking at those pieces of legislation. But as far as the throne speech legislative agenda, those weren't discussed. What was discussed and what I can accept as a good indication was an intention to have an amendment act to the Child Care and Protection Act. So that is being developed.
Did they give an indication of what that entails?
No.
And why it's an amendment rather than an overhaul of that Child Care and Protection Act?
Not at that time, but it was mentioned in relation to the government's commitment to continued and increased protection of children. So I look forward to seeing what that looks like. I hope that there would be consideration for some of the points that would have been made in the consultation that was done on those joint pieces of legislation that was a joint committee back in, I think it was 2014 or 2015 thereabouts.
Well, the Child Care and Protection Act, I think it was among the same, when persons made the submission, it was in 2018, that final report.
Right.
Around the Sexual Offences Act, which is why I was quite keen in whether or not they had spoken about it, because the matter of domestic violence is one thing, but you're talking about intimate intimate partner violence and, you know, the rape laws and how protective they are and so on. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So some other areas.
So nothing around the National Human Rights Institute, Jade?
You know,
I'm being cheeky.
No, there was no mention of it. There was no mention of the NHRI during the throne speech, and that's all I can say on that. Mikel, I'm not going to play into your hand. But what I can also bring some attention to is some of the intended changes around our national security framework. So I heard the Governor General speaking about intended amendments to, for example, the Fingerprints Act, to the Correctional Act, I think it is, to the
Jamaica Eye you had mentioned to me.
Yes, there's supposed to be an expansion of Jamaica Eye as well. So we'll be monitoring those developments. I mean, in consideration of our legislative trend, we'll be keeping a keen eye on those amendments.
So my key area of focus, not necessarily JFJ's, but Mikel's in particular,
yes.
Constitutional reform, becoming a republic, as I said, no disrespect at all to the Governor General, but it irks me that we're having our parliament opening with the representative of King Charles III.
Yes, and that was clearly stated, as you know, is required.
And our legislation, when they're written, it's paying homage to the United Kingdom. So those things I don't find favor with. Yes. So did the Parliament or through the Governor General mention anything about the Republic? For example, was Caribbean Court of Justice, the CCJ, mentioned at all?
No. So what was mentioned is our intention to move towards a republic through the effort of the Ministry of Legal.
So just the Republic, just
Affairs.
Nothing around CCJ?
No, not at this time. That was not mentioned at all. So I like I said, we look forward to seeing how quickly some of these developments come forth.
So I put on back my JFJ hat now.
Yes,
that was a Mikel hat just now.
Okay.
So I think from a JFJ standpoint, as you rightly outlined, Jade, there were several things that we do welcome. It's one of those things, unfortunately, where we have heard it before. But I think Domestic Violence Act, within the context of the throne speech, I don't remember it being said. It has been uttered by parliamentarians, certainly through their Twitter accounts in particular. And I think, to be fair to Minister Green, she has done a remarkable job in some instances with the sexual harassment legislation. So I think it's for the wider parliament to be brave, which is my disappointment around Sexual Offences Act not being spoken of. We need parliamentarians to be brave, stop focusing on homosexuality rather than removing the buggery law so that our men and boys can get access to justice if they are raped.
Yes.
Right? So those are the things that I would have hoped the National Human Rights Institute and certainly conversations around the CCJ. Right? So
yes. I don't want to. Well, we are at the end of our time. Wow. I just wanted to mention one or two other important stories that we would have heard in the week. Sending our
10 seconds.
Oh. Okay, so just sending our strength to the alleged victim at the University of the West Indies. That story, as an organization that commits to gender-based violence and fighting gender-based violence, was quite appalling for us. So we are welcoming the fact that there will be some support provided to that student, and we hope that those persons affected by GBV will reach out to JFJ.
And JFJ, we're making some attempts to go to the university.
Yes, and to do some public education and support. So we would update those of you interested on that in our social media pages when there's an update.
So 5 seconds, Jade, your trivia win.
Okay, so apparently this week we have 2 winners, simultaneous winners.
Oh, really?
So in the interest of time, I'm gonna ask that our social media person just reach out to the winners and let them know that they have won. But the date of the answer to the trivia is August 14th, June 4th, 1971. My apologies. Right. So thank you for joining us. I am Jade Williams.
I'm Mikel Jackson, and we will see you next week.
The people's champion. Our mission is love. Our vision is love. Jamaicans, for justice. The people's champion.